Bene, buongiorno.
Good afternoon, everybody. Good afternoon, everybody. This has been a very long day, and we're going to have a final session in this August week. Thank you very much for being here. Thank you in particular to our illustrious guest, President Giuliano Amato. This warm applause shouldn't, however, prevent us from remembering the important achievements that this illustrious guest has obtained. He's still very young, and in spite of that, he's accomplished great achievements throughout his life. He's been a politician, he's been active in government, and he's been a man of the institutions, and lately a man who's been deeply involved in cultural issues, as we've all learned. And now he's a judge in the Italian Constitutional Court. As we're going to talk about culture, we couldn't but have a more interesting guest to talk to this evening. And this is also because one of the monuments of our Italian culture, the Treccani Encyclopedia, is run by a foundation, and Giuliano Amato is the president of this foundation. Today, we're going to ask him a deep, complex, and yet familiar question. Familiar as the title of this year's meeting is. You are a good for us. This title involves us all, and I think it involves us all this year more than in the past. Also, this very beginning of the meeting has been so lively. We've all experienced this title as a part, as an integral part of all of us, because we really all wish that the other one is a part of us. This is a human, very deep desire, and yet sometimes we behave as if the other were not a part of us. So, in positive and negative terms, I think we are all, so to say, touched and inspired by this you and by this promise. Is this only a personal issue? I think that what we've started seeing at the beginning of this edition of the meeting seemed to imply that the you as a good for us, as a good for everybody, has a lot to do with the history of our country and with current affairs. It seems to me that the title of this edition, of this year's edition, is very precisely interpreted and touched upon in all the events, in all the meetings of this year meeting. And this title gives us a right way to interpret the history of our country. And our country is this year celebrating 70 years from the beginning of the Italian Republic. That's why Giorgio Vittadini and the other members of the staff of the meeting thought about an exhibition of the meeting. This exhibition and the events of the meeting would like to underline some of the most important cornerstones of the 70 years. The interpretation of this 70 years is very simple. The aim of the exhibition is to highlight all the items that induce us to think of the history of our republic as something positive and to think positively to the future. And culture is definitely one of these factors. The past, the assembly that led to the drafting of our constitution, the tragedies that have characterized our country, then the role of Italy in the world and the future. So culture. We are all interested in understanding, and we would like to understand this through the help and the dialogue with Mr. Amato, how we can interpret the word culture throughout the 70 years of our republic. That is why I would like to remind you all, at least it was useful for me to be reminded of this, I would like to remind you all what Mr. Violante and Mr. Vittadini said when officially opening the exhibition, and also what President Mattarella said yesterday when he inaugurated the exhibition yesterday. For example, he said, and I quote, "The Republic helped us reconstruct our history as a single country and reconnect both ethically and culturally the first Risorgimento period with the second Risorgimento," so with the resistance movement and the liberation of Italy. End of quote. And the President Mattarella also gave us lots of food for thought concerning the method, which is a method based on dialogue that was very much focused on by Pope Francis and was mentioned yesterday by the President here. So having said this, I would like to leave the floor to President Amato, and we would like to give his personal contribution. We would like to learn from you, because we believe that culture is such only if it raises the curiosity of people and if it enables us to open ourselves towards the other, thereby enlightening everybody's path. That's why we're very happy for you to be here. And we really look forward to listening to what you're going to tell us. Thank you. Thank you, Lorenza. Thank you. Thanks, everybody. Thanks, everybody, for being here. The question which is at the core of this meeting, I think, is the right one. So finding an answer and finding the answers to this question is not that easy. I've thought a lot about this. And I've sort of given myself some kind of a compass to analyze this 70 years of the Italian Republic, to analyze the major changes that we Italians had to live. Changes that in a way highlighted this need for the you, this need for recognizing and acknowledging the other, and have at the same time ignited and started processes which tended to in a way erase the other. I wondered what helped Italians maintain this culture of acknowledging the others alive, of recognizing this common good, which is at the very basis of any social experience. I'll be very schematic in my presentation. Anyway, from this point of view, it seems to me that the beginning of our new life between the Italian resistance movement and the formation of the Italian Republic is still extraordinary. The beginning of this 70 years, this beginning arrived when the 20th century had already showed its worst experiences, totalitarianism, forms of totalitarianisms, 2 world wars, both of which originating in Europe with millions of dead. The 20th century had led to the mass killings of ethnic groups they were hostile to someone. So, for example, Armenians at the beginning of the century, or anyone of Jewish religion in the 1930s. Between 1946, 47, 45, 46, and 47, we started a new life. And this new life was characterized by a concurrence of different forms of cultures. So political culture, a culture of the arts, that we would not find back again in the future. This concurrence of different forms of cultures were very much in symphony one with the others. People would refer to this symphony with the phrase civil commitment of the intellectuals, and many other people would then contradict and express their negative opinion against this phrase, meaning siding with one side or the other. Not only Bendia or Bobbio tended to believe that this kind of illustration was not the correct one. And the very same Elio Vittorini denied to reach that stage vis-à-vis the party that he was more in line with. In those years, the cultural engagement was the engagement of those who wanted to commit themselves after many years of, so to say, evasion. Maybe the eldest among us can remind this. You probably remember the cinema of white telephones. That was raging. And this at the very same time when racial laws were applied, were being enforced in Italy. At the same time when many of our citizens would deny and would conspire against the Jews in order for them to be brought to Auschwitz. So culture would, in those very same years, showed how important this was. So there was a huge commitment on the part of literature, of the very same cinema. Cinema is, in my opinion, one of the most important reflections of the cultural trends of a country. So that was a commitment, the commitment of those who started looking at reality. As Cesare Zavattini said, and I quote, writers and directors wanted to regain the time lost. They wanted to look at things. They wanted to look at things. They wanted to see man, the man and the things that they had neglected for so many years. And when they started looking, really looking at the man and at the things they had started neglecting for years, they found the head of a family whom was stolen a bicycle, who would lose his job without that bicycle, and would spend and would lose his job because of that. Or the old pensioners with his dignity, the dignity of a lone old man who no longer suffices himself, but who claims his dignity as a person. So in this sense, our commitment was to find reality back in full symphony, in full combination, vis-à-vis that culture that would inspire the assembly in charge of the drafting of our constitution, that was set up with members coming from different cultural milieus. Norberto Bobbio would then write that person-centered culture that would inform Umberto D, and this assembly can be seen in Aldo Moro's classes on law philosophy in 1945-46, and it can be found also in the writings by Giuseppe Capograssi, who was a completely different personality than Moro. And it was exactly this culture, the culture that was at the basis of our society. So a culture that at the same time was antithetical to the fascist one, but at the same time also to that of the liberal individualism that preceded fascism. So in this kind of culture, the individual with his or her own rights and duties would precede the state. And the individual who lives in intermediary foundations, in the communities, in this well before then in the state, in these communities where each and any one of us enriches together with the others our own personality and the personality of the others. This culture has a Catholic imprinting, it is undeniable that the cultural primacy is of Giorgio Lapira, Dossetti, the very same Aldo Moro, as well as, and especially these individuals who spoke in favor of this type of culture. This created a common ground with the socialist, communist left of the country that would have found it much more difficult to find an agreement with liberal-oriented parties, which, however, found an agreement exactly based on this, on the recognition of social and civil values, of the recognition of the person, and because of this was willing to have this kind of community of interests. This is something that should be borne in mind. The politicians, today's politicians, vis-a-vis the ones of the past, might be of might have a lesser profile. However, we have to say that it was the cultures that the politicians of the past had in themselves that led them to disagreements one with the other. It is not by chance that the representatives of the old liberal state, although they were present within the assembly, were not predominant, they were marginal, they were not even called to be part of the Committee of the 75, in other words, the committee that really drafted the text of our constitution. So our constitution was based on a culture that was different. So the Italian Republic was originated exactly in this context. And the major political cultures within which the participation of everybody to the Republican democracy would last for many, many years. So after tens of years, we still probably do not recognize well enough what it meant that Alcide De Gasperi, who was, so to say, this kind of a barrier against communism. So Alcide De Gasperi, who was also supported by right-wing electorate that was very much nostalgic of the old fascist regime. So it is not by chance that Alcide De Gasperi gradually recognized himself in the principles and in the values of democracy, and that on the other side, Palmiro Togliatti, who still had militants with weapons ready in their barns, and I'm being serious about that. They had their weapons ready. So Palmiro Togliatti contributed to what was done. This goes to the merit, to the very merit of the Italian Constitution. In other words, the fact that this was a common ground, a commonly recognized ground by all parties. This was a passage that between the 1940s and 1950s was a very positive moment of those years. After that, two major changes occurred. Actually, lots of major changes occurred, but two are worth mentioning. Like all transformations, these two major changes bring good and bad aspects with themselves. The problem we faced was that in both cases, the bad aspects found less obstacles than would have been useful. And there are still certain moments in which people doubt that the good aspects were there. So the first change was the season of 1968, around 1968. So a season in which lots of rights were claimed vis-a-vis old hierarchies. So, for example, equal treatment between men and women. People claimed that it was not right that the family were in a way subjected to the power of the husband. So the man who was also the head of his spouse. And it was also not right that young people were entirely subjected without having the possibility of giving a say, of having a say, they were subjected to the decisions of their children. So 1968 brought our society to overcome these hierarchies. But it was also followed by terrorism and by this multiplication of rights over time to highlight forms of individualism. And individualism apparently was no longer capable of understanding what was feasible and what was not. And this was the first major change. The second major change took place, first of all, through Europe, and secondly, through immigration. And it consisted in rediscovering the ethnic and religious differences coexisting, which are called upon to coexist. So especially at the beginning, we in Italy had the chance to appreciate the strength and the richness that could be derived from this. Probably because we well remembered that our Italian nature is the result of the many different ethnic groups that came here to this peninsula and were able to feed and to nourish a part of our being Italian, of our Italian nature, in cultural terms, in architectural terms, in terms of language, in terms of food and wine, as well as many other forms of traditions. And today, after this major, intense flow of migrations, I don't know how many of us still continue to think of diversity as something that can enrich us. What is certain is that this ethnic identity is now being seen more as an evil, and this to a very great extent. So I wonder how much, the extent to which our culture has helped us live these transformations. This is very difficult to face. So this, the question that we're called upon to answer. And I would like to answer this question exactly as Corrado Stagliano would have done it. He was the curator of a book, the editor of a book called La Cultura del Novecento, edited at the end of last century by La Terza Publishing House, where he stated that literary culture did really little to guide us and help us solve the problems we had. Not so long ago, the book of a good economist, Pierluigi Ciocca, was published. The title is Ai confini dell'economia, elogio dell'interdisciplinarità. In this book, he stated that compared with the economy, so many people have even felt negative opinions vis-a-vis the economists. Actually, our literary culture was defined by what Moravia defined as a commitment which people do not really want to take on, leading to pathways that do not help us really enter into the surrounding culture, be it the ways in which Giuseppe Berto or Paolo Giordano or Gadda, we are all talking about analysis, very fascinating analysis of the human soul, but which are timeless. They are not linked to the topics that we've had to face. And these topics I lived those years. Probably young people do not remember it. But the end of the old hierarchies and the extension of our rights have led to a major collective cultural change that was really enormous. Everything was changing. Urban sprawl. We were used at living in small cities. Our grandparents, our uncles, we had big families. Families would be united on Sundays, and so everybody's problems were the problems of the entire family. The family has become a family composed by just one person or a couple living in the cities, and there's nothing of the old family ties around them. I personally experienced this life, and I know what it means to be able to grow up, children maybe looking at a hospital and making the right decisions when you're young and you have nobody supporting you. And also work. Has become more and more individual. So the big conglomerates that had represented the real fabric, where the personalities of many people would become less and less. People would find themselves alone in these big cities, alone to make decisions on themselves. This change would question the model of the society where the assembly drawing up the constitution was based. So these kind of communities, and this also to the detriment of our security. The old hierarchies were unjust, that's true, but yet we had found repression in it, but also a kind of an authority that we could need. There were bans in that model, but at the same time also an experience that could be useful to listen to. And we've become alone. And the potential of choice before us over the years has become wider and wider. We've faced more and more possibilities of choice. We've found ourselves in a situation in having a child, as had always happened, or not having a child with anti-conceptionals. And that was a choice. We even decided of having in vitro fertilization, homologous, heterologous fertilization. And actually, when I think of these issues, I always tend to think about my mother. Actually, I would have to explain to my mother everything from the very beginning. This is something which was completely new. So what kind of interpretation keys did we have, being so alone, to address these choices? Those who used to give us suggestions from the cultural milieu, where could they have been identified? Pierpaolo Pasolini mentioned and highlighted a lot what we were going to lose. You probably remember the history of fireflies that were about to disappear. In order to remember actually what he meant, I found out a poem by him, and he basically said, "I do not know nothing of this new course of history. I am a layman. I am a laggard, left outside. But I understand only one thing. I understand that the idea of the good is about to die. The good that I can see in the beautiful mornings in Italy or in India, in his own work with animals, with land animals, working on the field, tilling the land. The man working and getting the crop of his work. The man repeating the same gestures of his father. Because this man in his heart has nothing, no other feelings in his heart than religion. This is, in synthesis, the content of a poem written by Pierpaolo Pasolini. This is just to highlight that we are taken away, ripped off from a world that we have to live back, but they are essential, and we are lonely. And being lonely, we have to decide of things before which mankind had never made a decision. The Census Institute by Derrida did a lot to understand and explain to us the risks we run with this idea of freedom coinciding with this unconditional search for one's own interest. So the risk of finding in our own solitude that technological consumption could replace friendships and evenings spent together with the others. Lorenzo Ornaghi and Vittorio Parsi also reflected a lot on this, and they talked about angry selfishness, forms of selfishness without individuality, in which we run the risk to fall, and we did fall on this in this situation. Other people talked about this rush towards liberation. There was really a true liberation of the Italians. It had started with Volare and then ended with Saturday Night's Fever, with all the perils that this can bring with itself. So, for example, alcohol consumption, drug abuse, the risk of seeing one's own children during the night because they had an accident with their car.
We were helped to find the keys to be guided after the turn of the century, of the millennium, by two philosophers. They stated once again the inevitable reasons of a collective ethics that has to be shared, which could lead to the end of the risk that the ethics could become an individual ethics, each individual for himself or herself. These two philosophers were Habermas and Joseph Ratzinger. In 2004, the first one was not, the former was not a believer, and the other one, the latter was a cardinal of the church. And they both shared the same ideas. It was essential to recognize ourselves in a common, shared platform of values built on what we had built in the past. It was essential. That was the foundation of what we call the post-secular society. Well, you wouldn't have expected that philosophers would give you would tell you the better way to live your lives. It is generally thought that philosophers are useless, but they are extremely useful. On the contrary, and I would like to insist on this, in our own experience, we didn't have the necessary knowledge to answer the questions we were confronted with. Think about this for a moment. Today, we are debating, as there was a debate 100 years ago, whether there is a right for a young person to know his or her own biological parent. 100 years ago, knowing your own biological father or mother meant that you got to know a man who had an affair with a married woman and with an illegitimate, so to say, child, and the woman was paid, provided that nobody knew who the real father was, in order to preserve his honor and his dignity. So nobody had to know. However, the biological parent was the mother who had left her kid in front of institutions in Florence or in other towns. Now, the question refers to those who provide their semen to a genetic bank and who can probably become the biological parents of hundreds of kids. And they have no reason to feel these kids as their own. So the question changes when it comes to this sense. But please tell me, is it acceptable for a kid, for a child looking for his or her own identity, that this has no sense at all? So we are astonished by these questions, and we may also feel astonished by the various possible answers. Well, there are countries in which something is legitimate and accepted, and other countries in which this is not. So we are concerned by the fact that in this case we are at the border line of the situation in which the creature is separated from the creator. The border which Ulysses wanted to overcome, and despite Ulysses was invited to follow virtues and knowledge, Ulysses was placed in the hell, in one of the parts of the hell by Dante. Dante decided to place him in the hell because, in Inferno, because he decided to go over the border. And he wanted to replace God in this sense. But we need to be aware, because culture is not something new. Culture with which we can answer is always a culture of the Constituent Assembly, the same culture of Umberto Dio, a famous Italian film of the neorealism movement, the culture which leads us to acknowledge that all the others have the same dignity and the same rights that we have. This is the common platform stated by Ratzinger and Habermas. And Habermas, just a few years earlier, had stated and had promoted the lack of the availability of the genetic heritage of the would-be baby for the parents. And he then saw that this was at risk because of the pre-implant diagnosis. And in this sense, this identity was put at risk because of the dissemination in other countries of the semen banks, not in Italy, but in other countries. It is possible to decide the features of the kid, of the child you're going to have. In this way, Habermas said, we question the freedom of the future baby to reach self-determination. So there's a point which must be clear to us all. Confronted with these new questions and confronted with this extension of the rights, the cultural keys to answer are always the same that we had in the past, yet they function only if we use them and we apply them to the entire lives, not only to certain aspects. We cannot live as individuals who are not interested in what happens to the other people, only interested in reaching and having everything we can, and then think that we can have an ethics when we reach that border. We need to have this ethics before we reach the border. Otherwise, we run the risk of going beyond that border. The risk is that of leaving not being aware of what happens. And we run this risk every day. Technology gives us the possibility to have something new. I don't have the iPhone. I don't have a smartphone. I have an outdated mobile phone. But everybody has an iPhone. So why shouldn't I grasp this opportunity? I I can know the temperature of Timbuktu. So why should I deprive myself of the joy to know the temperature in Timbuktu? I can know my heart rate. So why shouldn't I do this? I can talk through Skype with a person who lives thousands of kilometers away, and I can do it for free. Why shouldn't I grasp this opportunity? So everything which is feasible is something that we are ready to do. And in this case, Pope Francis, in this case, we have what he calls the anesthesia of being accustomed to something. So we reach saturation and we get accustomed with things that were inconceivable in the past. And this is an anesthesia. We do not understand and we cannot grasp the lesion and the pain that we provoke. So we get addicted, and this happens with the iPhone. It may happen with Skype or with the iPhone. But if we create a sequence, well, all this can happen. I would like to say something very briefly. I have Marta Cartabria in front of me. She is a senior judge of the Constitutional Court, and I found her when I entered the Constitutional Court. So in our work, the anesthesia of addiction has never entered. We realize things that were explained in addition to to people who have the faith. There are things which have been explained by people who have no faith. We are in tragic situations in our lives at times, and we need to choose. There is no harmony on this planet arranging everything. We need to be able to choose. We must be able to choose. As Birdie said, the choice of the other people is inside our conscience, the priority choice, because we know that it is there. And we can ignore it only if we forget that it is there. And therefore, we delete it as if it were not there. Well, during our work in the Constitutional Court, we find ourselves in this situation. We know that we must choose, and we know that we must balance, we must strike a balance, and we know that at times it is not our task to do it. It is a task of the Parliament when we don't find in the Constitution the beacon for the right choice. But I can assure you that the individualism that seemed endless in the Constitutional Court has no place. Individualism has found a new strength in front of the other transformation that has come in our societies, namely going back to coexistence with people belonging to other ethnic groups or other religions. That was a natural kind of return if we consider the history of mankind. It was just a parenthesis for the long history, the parenthesis of the nation states, especially after the Westphalia peace, which gave to each state an ethnic group and a religion. That was just a moment, just a parenthesis, the parenthesis which accustomed us to societies with one religious or one ethnic groups. But all the societies which were born outside Europe were born, and they developed according to several branches. We Italians are just one branch of the population that constitutes the American citizens. The same can be said for Canada. The same can be said for Australia. This is typically a European problem. We've got accustomed to living on our own as one single ethnic group. And this created hostility vis-à-vis the newcomers. So we have prejudices, we have bias, or we are afraid of those who we do not know, or we may feel hostile towards those who do not recognize essential rights, such as the rights of women and of children. Although one of those essential rights, a woman can have a bath without any bathing suit, or with a bikini, or with a burkini. So it should be possible. So this is my opinion, at least. So these are reasons that has to be taken into account by those having a responsibility when it comes to the government. But we have to be clear about one aspect. If there is a clash, this clash is going to take place with the greatest revolution of the human history, a revolution that was only announced by Jesus, who was the first one to base his own philosophy on the equality of all the human beings. And obviously, he didn't manage to have success in disseminating this theory, because at that time all the economies worked thanks to the slaves, and so he was too advanced when it comes to his thoughts. But his revolution over the centuries started to catch, and it remained vis-à-vis our beliefs, and it remained a sort of revolutionary thought, because we continue to think what we were taught over 2,000 years ago. We continue to think that the rights are only for citizens, whereas the rights are for each human being who is living on this planet. This is a truth, the truth of everybody. It is not the truth that has been revealed. It is a truth which has been catching, and it was spoken 200 years ago by somebody who said that all men are created equal. And while he was writing this, slavery still existed in the US. This system of economics could not last. The slaves, of course, wanted and demanded to be free. And in our society, the rights and the freedoms were given to those who had attended school, or those who owned the land. It could not last. The rights had to be the same for everybody. And this is why the Charter of Rights became more and more disseminated. The Charter of Rights, which we are proud of, are all charters in which the rights are there for everybody. The rights proclaimed are available for everybody. So there is no doubt that the principle of proportionality must be applied. Undoubtedly, there are rights which cost a lot. The fact of not having contributed to the life of a specific community makes people weaker in terms of integral recognition of the rights for all. But it never justifies denying these rights. The constitutional courts and not the political entities which establish the rights of immigrants and the rights of illegal immigrants as well. Because it is very difficult for politicians, because in this respect, we need to bear in mind that there is hostility. Hostility leads us to deny what cannot be denied any longer today. It is the core of the safeguard. The child of an immigrant living here, either legal or illegal, must have the right to attend school. Otherwise, he or she is going to be a second league adult. A woman who is about to give birth to a kid must have the right to be assisted and to be helped in a hospital. And nobody should ask her whether she's illegal or a legal immigrant. But these statements have to be made by the courts, by the constitutional courts. To conclude, I would like to say that I am quite convinced today that although we hear more often those people who are against this dissemination of rights, I believe that there is a culture of recognizing the other people, and there is a greater availability to feel solidarity more than in the past. In the past, the volunteers were the only carriers and holders of these values, but today they are just the pioneers of these ideas. There is a culture of commitment, of engagement, which can be seen in 1,000 ways and which can be found in many different aspects. But I saw people not being linked to volunteering organizations going into Rome to the Tiburtina station to bring soap, toilet paper, and bread to the immigrants, because these things were needed, were the first necessities of these people, because they are not animals, they are human beings, and so they needed these things to start their days. There's a research by the Census dated 2013, and this research stated with some data, it stated that the season of individualism had come to an end. And in the Italians, there was a growing perception of our way of behaving of the past, namely solidarity. Solidarity was growing, and I was impressed by this question. How do you think Italy will be in 2020? The answer was it's going to have more foreign people, more less wealthy, but it's going to be more based on solidarity. So it is not rhetoric on my part. I am quite an old professor, but the experience that I continue to have coming from young people I spend my time with, this experience tells me that this culture of recognizing the other people is much stronger among the young people, stronger than we may think. The young people know where this comes from. It comes from songs, from readings, from books, from prayers, from experiences. They know where it comes from. And I am impressed that this is so much the case in educated young people. Their medicine, anthropology, and management are naturally at the service of the other people, of the needed. They combine their innovative skills when it comes to knowledge and to manage things with innovative thoughts vis-à-vis the outdated individualisms. I'm not talking about solidarity or pietas only. This is an attitude made by the fact that they accept the world as it is. I live in a world where I live and other people live as well. They have simply recognized that this is a situation. The other people are just like me. And so I work with them and for them as I would do in any other community. Of course, in this, we run the risk, and we see this risk in Italy, that we may experience a clash between generations because the old generations think it differently. Among those of my generation and following generations, there is less readiness to accept changes and to be tolerant, to accept the future, because the elderly have less future to experience than the young people. I wondered many times how we can avoid this clash between generations. And you can see this clash of generations when it comes to political elections, to the trends towards political vote. So young people tend to vote for several parties, whereas the elderly tend to vote for the other parties. And I will not dwell into details in this respect. We need to take into account the reasons of those who mistrust, but not because the reasons of mistrust are grounded, but only because if we are asked, this means that we need to welcome and to receive all the people who arrive. This is the key question. The answer is no. This is not what anybody is asking. Not even Pope Francis said we need to welcome all. Pope Francis is asking for something different. We need to be aware. Pope Francis is asking for our willingness that nobody lags behind. There's a book I've recently presented on the life of this extraordinary Pope. I believe that nobody knows that he was also a sort of a person responsible for door checks in front of a disco when he was young. So the Pope is asking for nobody to be left behind. This means that we have to use in the best way possible our legacy, our knowledge, our heritage, because we have young people who are open to the others and to the world. So we need to be open for these young people, and we should not resort to the prohibition to enter, so no entry. We should go back to the assisted collaboration. Assisting other people costs less than enriching those people who get rich because they try to keep these immigrants in the centers for identification as long as they can. It costs less to organize ourselves, to talk with these people, and to propose a possible future to these people. This is cheaper. And I would like to tell you something. An illegal immigrant who was selling trinkets, bags, fake bags along the beach. And he was selling these bags. That man was extremely clever. I talked with him several times. Now he returned to his own homeland, to his country, and he established a firm for agriculture production. So a small amount was enough as a deposit, and he was happy to go back to his country. Human beings who are all like we are not happy to walk on the beaches for kilometers every day under the sun in order to earn just a few euros. If they are given an opportunity, that they are more than happy to go back to their home country. This is what we should do. Our human legacy, our legacy of solidarity should be used for this. And in this way, I conclude vis-à-vis myself and in front of you that it was a beautiful period, the period of the beginning of the Republic, and we needed to face many difficult times, facing the evil and the negative aspects. We now have excellent possibilities to go on for the new beginning of this Republic, which should be richer in humanity and which should be more open to the world vis-à-vis the one we started with. And hopefully the diagnosis that I gave you as young people, as the pivot for this change, is a diagnosis that can involve as many young people as possible and to give serenity to everybody, even to the elderly who mistrust these new situations, and they should be helped to gain trust in the other people. And we should all believe that the world can be beautiful only if each one of us is in peace, not only with him or herself, but with the others as well. So we thank President Amato because his lecture on the cultural history of Italy is something we should cherish. And we too want to have this kind of perspective. So we should be realistic, but also open and full of hope. So while this lecture was drawing to a close, I was thinking that the work we carried out with the young people, with the exhibition on migrants, thanks to the direction of Giorgio Paolucci, was inspired by this spirit. It tries to face a new and problematic phenomenon with the same optic that was described by President Amato. And so hopefully we can be opened up to have a more profound and real view of the quest for our destiny. We still have several minutes, so we may have a brief Q&A session, if you agree. So maybe some of our students may ask questions on more problematic issues such as politics. So you evoked the good spirit which is inherent of every man, but this good spirit seems far away from some political events. So the beginning of the Italian Republic meant to bring this spirit of good into society. But the question is, how can we go back to this sense of unity in such a difficult period? So we still have 15 minutes, if you like. So we can have some questions, and then we will draw to a close after this fruitful contribution.
Good evening, Mr. President. At the beginning of your contribution, you said that it was not that much the high profile of old times politicians, but rather their culture that favored the meeting between the members of the assembly that drew up the constitutions. And you mentioned Togliatti and De Gasperi. So also, the exhibition on the 70 years of our republic focuses very much on this compromise between the two. As a university student, I am very much interested in going into the details of this culture, the culture that you mentioned, also in view of this new beginning that you've just talked about before closing your contribution. So I suggest that we collect a number of questions before Mr. Amato provides an answer to all of them.
Presidente, lei ha parlato di una...
Mr. President, you mentioned an inclusive culture and a culture, today's culture, which is more based on individualism, where you have angry, peculiar forms of individualism. And you also mentioned major possibilities we have. So my question is it still possible to have a vision in politics like the one that the assembly that drew up the constitution had? What are the prerequisites for politics not to be intended as a clash of ideologies? You also highlighted, you've also given us a lot of cultural examples. So 70 years after the beginning of the Republic, is it still meaningful to celebrate this anniversary? Mr. President, unlike what you said concerning the world of today's world, which is selfish, the title of this meeting is something good. You are good for me, but it can be at the origin of a culture of subsidiarity. As the exhibition rightly points out, in Italy there is lots of examples that appear to lead to other revolutions. So as a student, what kind of personalities and lines of thought can be present in Italy that favor the development of this marginalized culture?
Signor Presidente.
Mr. President, you talked about a culture in which man, with his rights and duties, come before the state. However, today we have a state which is very much present and intervenes a lot. Italy is a country where we have the largest number of World Heritage Sites. So against this background, what kind of potential do we have? What does the state have to do and what the individual has to do in this respect? When I warned you that it is not so much a matter of virtues of the individual, but rather a matter of the cultures of the individuals. Actually, these cultures also translate into the virtues of the individuals. I I just wanted to point out one interesting thing that emerges from your questions. I wanted to point out that if you have a policy that is the result not so much of a search for consensus, but rather that is the result of a vision of society that we want to achieve to the benefit of those that I am doing politics for. This makes the politician more virtuous and gives him fertile ground, a fertile ground in which his virtues can develop and be rooted. So the class of politicians of the first years of our republic belonged to the same area of those who wrote books or poems. I was an intimate friend of a politician who was Antonio Giuliani, and he declared himself as a non-politician, and actually he had a strong anti-fascist commitment, and actually he worked in the publishing house where he worked with Calvino and Pavese, and at the same time he worked in parliament. We don't need profiles like Antonio Giuliani. I don't know if you've ever read the diaries, Alcide De Gasperi's diaries. De Gasperi was a literary man. And had he not been De Gasperi, he would have probably been known for his diaries, like many other writers. In other words, we are talking about educated people who liked to read the same things that literate experts were. Nobody of them ignored Benedetto Croce, also the ones who did not agree with him. Now everything has changed, and I cannot expect from those who are 30 years today read the same books that I used to read. And as a matter of fact, I tend to wonder actually how, for example, young people can find their way in the world if they haven't read certain books by Dostoevsky or Thomas Mann. And then I think that we had lots of very good Italians between the 18th and 19th hundred that actually were trained without reading Dostoevsky or Thomas Mann because they came afterwards, because these two authors came afterwards. So one can educate himself and train himself in many different ways. The problem is that most of the times you have the feeling that politics has become an activity that is only based on communication, on the fact that you can talk with the others, that you can grasp what the others expect from you to say, and that you're better than others of telling the audience that you, in a way, can acknowledge their feedback to give them a positive response. If politics is only this, you lack culture and you lack virtues. Celebrating the 70 years of our republic and then the 80 years of our republic and then the 90th anniversary is meaningful because this helps us understand exactly this. Anniversaries should be celebrated. They're not celebrated and they're despised by those who want to deny the past. But those who want to deny the past will never be able to give a future to themselves and to the others, and I'm convinced of this. On the occasion of the 150th anniversary of the Italian Unity. I was the president of the committee, and I visited a lot of schools. And in those schools, marvelous teachers had their students, also young pupils, work on this anniversary, on the 150th anniversary. So not necessarily on Mr. Cavour, Garibaldi or Mazzini. They rediscovered heroes of their own country. There was a young girl who read out, and I still have this image in mind, she read out the history of her grand-grandparent, grand-grandfather, who actually was participated in the first strike in the mine where he worked, and thanks to that he was able to put himself at the service of the others, and she was proud of her grand-grandfather. And thanks to this in-depth analysis, this girl was able to find part of her identity. This is really very important. We are our past. And it is a limitation, our own limitation, that we are a part of our past without knowing this. So it's important to know it. You are good for me is, in my opinion, the emerging culture of our times. This is what I tried to convey to you in the final part of my speech. Also based on a study by Chances. There was this study, this survey on the values of the Italians. This survey was published in 2012. And the survey basically stated the end of this selfish individualism and the coming back to a need for ties, for links, for relationships. This was the thesis that was contained in the study. I believe that the driving force of this exactly lies in the young people we have today, because young people today are more accustomed of living surrounded by many different types of people, diverse types of people. So my grandchildren today go to schools in which they find people who are diverse from them, and they familiarize with them. There is a famous anecdote, a true anecdote, in which the father basically indicates, so points at a picture where a black person is, a black pupil is, and the child answers by indicating the red sweater of this child. So basically the father identifies that child from the color of their skin, the child identifies the pupil from the color of his sweater. This is very important because finally our young people have come back to the condition where Europeans used to live in, let's say, the 16th or 14th century, even before. For example, nobody in the past actually used to be surprised by the fact that people were diverse. So young people are the driving forces, driving engines of our culture of the future. However, in order not to have some kind of a short circuit with elder people, they have to be smart and they have to be capable of in a way, using all the tools at their disposal, coming back, so welcoming the others, and at the same time supporting foreigners, if they want to go back to their countries, which is not something to be compared with the fact that you need to invest in the countries where they want to have. Actually, I'm talking about people who are close to us. They want to have a future here. And it's not obligatory that the only future they find is under the bridges where they're compelled to live. We can help them finding this shelter and this job in their own home country. and they will be happy of that. So, talking about the potential of our country, much can be said about this, much can be said about our cultural heritage. We have a lot of cultural assets in many years. The other day I had a talk with Dario Franceschini, the Italian Minister for Culture. His Chinese colleague actually told him that there are about 100 million Chinese traveling towards your countries to visit them. In 10 years there will be 500 million Chinese. So actually we hope we'll be able to serve these Chinese even better in the future. What's really necessary to demand in order to exploit the potential of your country is to have governments that simply do not tell you that they've done a lot for you. These governments should, in a way, remove all the obstacles that you find in doing your activities and who eventually enable you to basically tell them, look at how many things we've done together. This is the real potential that we can exploit. Thank you very much. Thank you wholeheartedly to Professor Amato for his contribution and his readiness to answer our questions. The cultural issue is fundamental. So culture is a fundamental issue. We've always known that. Monsignor Giussani used to tell us that there are three dimensions of human action, which are culture and support and solidarity. And this lies in being supported by others, siding us and helping us pose the right questions. This cultural battle must be a continuous search and should induce us to really be opened up towards the new, to the importance and to the fundamental. Thanks to Giuliano, Amato, and thanks to you all for listening.